Ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready for the Wot Supp podcast. With your host, Stu, OG Industry Shannon, and Will warren-davey, new school formulator extraordinaire. We're talking all things supplements with insiders, athletes, experts, and more. So sit back, relax, and prepare to find out what's up.
G'day guys, welcome to another episode of the Wot Supp podcast. We have got an absolutely massive one for you today. A huge guest with a following of more than 80,000 people on his socials. It is Bill Campbell, PhD. He is a physique scientist and an exercise science professor. He is the man to talk to about all things physique. We've got him on. Thanks so much for coming on our show, Bill. It's a pleasure to have you, mate.
Yes, I'm very excited to have a conversation with you guys, and thank you for the invitation.
No problems at all. And of course, we have my regular co-host, Will warren-davey. Thanks for getting up at 5 a.m. this morning, Will, for coming on this show. Obviously, with the time difference, Bill being in the US, we have had to get up a little bit earlier than normal.
But it's more than worth it because we're going to pick the brain today of an absolute wizard here. I'm very excited, Bill, particularly because there's some research I wanted to touch on that I know you've been working on in the background. And I think we've managed to time this podcast because for the listeners who don't know, we actually reached out for this podcast probably about a month ago, I think it was, Bill, wasn't it, to try and slot it in. And your schedule has been so hectic that we literally had to plan about a month out to try and slot you in this morning's. And I think we had a really good opportunity because I think at that time I caught you on another podcast recently and you were just mentioning that in June there's an ISSN conference that you were going to be involved with. And that was where you were about to unravel a lot of research that you weren't allowed to speak about on previous podcasts. And I was just going to check in and see if that had actually happened yet, if that conference had gone ahead and if we could maybe delve into some of your findings that you could present there.
It hasn't happened yet, but let me ask, I'm assuming this isn't live, and if it's not live, when will you release this?
Oh, this one will be 1 to 2 weeks.
Yeah. So normally I do publish it about 7 days after we record.
Okay. So today's
But
Friday.
I can hold it off if you've got something that you'd like to talk about. I can hold off the release for whenever you like. If you have a specific date, I will not release the content until you've said, "Yep, it's good to go, boys."
So 1 week from today, I present on the data. So as long as you can wait 1 week, let's spill all the beans. Let's talk about what
let's do it. I will hold the content off until you've given us the go ahead, Bill.
All right.
We'll cut that little loop there. So I'll lead back in with a refresh question, and we'll just cut that last little bit of audio. So, all right, Bill. Now I remember on a previous podcast we had there, you had some amazing new research, and you weren't able to disclose the full amount, and this was on a really sort of cutting edge sort of studies that you'd just been authoring. And I think you weren't able to release that because you were due to present that this June in the ISSN conference. Now, I believe that data was something you couldn't previously disclose on any other podcast or publish that data at all. And I think we're lucky enough to just have the timing right to be able to fluke that today. So if you'd be so kind, mate, could you walk us through some of the findings that we were discussing at that conference that we had with the ISSN recently?
Yes. Yeah. And let me give a little context so people don't think I'm just being a jerk. You're not, for whatever reason, academic journals, let's just say the academic profession, they don't allow you to talk about your data until it's either been presented at a conference or published in a journal. Now, if somebody asked me why, I would say, I don't know. And I'd give a horrible answer of, that's just how it's always been, which is not a good answer. I just know that I don't want to be the person who's breaking the rules, the rules of integrity for data. So, but yeah, since we just presented this data at the International Society of Sports Nutrition, I am now free to talk about it because that information is now public. So what we did was a rapid fat loss study. And I had my students, I gave them some parameters, but I had my students design this study, and they did a great job. My study coordinators were Alex Brooks and Jack Quint. So they are now former master's students. So they designed this study. And here's what we did. And the context for this is my lab is focused on one of the things, but probably right now my main passion I want to find out how much body fat we can take off of the human body as quickly as possible without losing muscle mass, without slowing down metabolic rate. So aggressive, yes, but aggressive in the areas where we want it to be: fat loss, not losing muscle. So that's what we're focused on. So this is going to be the first of, I see my career just diving into this over the next few years. So the first of, I would say, several studies in this area. So we recruited lean, resistance trained males and females, and the entire study length was 6 weeks. 2 weeks of maintenance calories, so we could determine where they were at with their normal food intake. Then we had only a 2-week diet phase. Those 2 weeks, on average, we asked them to have a caloric deficit of 37.5%. And we're actually doing some exploratory work here. We had one group cut for 50% of their calories through the first week, 25% in the second week, which averages 37.5. And then the other group, just a straight 37.5 for both weeks. Now that's exploratory, so we can't do much with that because we just didn't have enough subjects. But we had plenty of subjects with the main question of what does an average 37.5% caloric deficit do over a 2-week period, or for 2 straight weeks. And then after that, we had a 2-week follow-up period where we told the subjects, do whatever you want, continue to diet, don't continue to diet, we don't care, but we want you to follow the diet for 2 weeks, and then whatever you want to do, awesome. So if for those people that kind of know my philosophies on fat loss and weight loss, this goes against a lot of what I believe people should do. A severe caloric deficit, or an aggressive one, I would say this is aggressive. You do lose muscle mass. You do suppress your metabolism. So those are things that we don't want. So why did I design a study around this? Well, we're trying to push the envelope to see. So what we found was, in these 2 weeks of diets, the subjects did awesome. And the amount of calories they reduced on average was 37.6%, which was exactly what we prescribed. I didn't expect that to happen. I thought maybe not quite that high. And they lost about 1.2% body fat over those 2 weeks. And that's really good, because usually 1% per month is a pretty good rate.
Yeah, wow.
They lost, sometimes my memory, I just want to make sure I get it right. And actually, I need to look at my notes, because I think in pounds, and I know your audience is kilograms. So they lost 1 kilogram of body fat and about 0.5 kilogram of fat-free mass. So as I look at this, the way that I'm interpreting this data is, okay, they lost a little bit of muscle mass. About 1/3 of the weight that they lost was in the form of fat-free mass. That's not ideal. It's not horrible. Yep. And if somebody's goal is to lose fat, well, maybe, you lose a little bit more muscle mass than what we like. And by the way, the standard, at least my standard, is out of about 3/4 fat, 1/4 muscle mass. That's very typical in the weight loss literature. Now, of course, my world and your world's a little different, because we're dealing with already fit, lean people. And so I'd be like, well, it was aggressive. The rate of weight loss was about 1.1% per week. So that's a little faster than what I like. Usually I like to say no more than 1% per week. And I'm almost done talking. I know I've been talking for a long time.
No, this is just the reason that Stu and I are just dumbfounded is because this is like phenomenal research, because you don't get to see this level of a deficit applied in a study again with resistance trained athletes in particular, outside of some of the early starvation studies. Really, like 50% deficit for anyone listening at home. You know, if your maintenance calories are 2,000 calories and you're on 1,000 calories a day, and you're trying to and you're going through body composition analysis as well, and tracking that muscle mass, tracking that body fat as well, and looking at actual changes. This is data we don't often get to see, and this is really quite amazing that listeners get to hear this probably the first time anywhere, which is phenomenal. Now, and to unpack that a little, Bill, I think looking at, as you said, you've got sort of an optimal ratio that you've sort of, put on socials recently, I think, where, it's sort of 4-to-1 ideally, because we always want to maintain that muscle mass when we're dieting. So in this study here, we found is there, in your experience, I suppose, a bit of a turning point where you find now that you've done the severe end and your more typical moderate end of the spectrum with a calorie deficit, is there somewhere that you found the best, I guess, bang for your buck in terms of muscle retention versus speed of loss, where you're getting that a lot more favorable retention of muscle mass, but still a reasonable rate of loss? Is there a sort of, range that you like to advise people, to sort of stay within?
Yeah. And I do have one more data point to share on this study.
Please do.
But yes, let me answer that question. Typically, I think 25%, a 25% caloric deficit with high protein, with resistance training, seems to really be, at least in my opinion, that seems to be about the threshold where the fat loss is noticeable. It's not so slow, and it's not so much of a deficit that you lose a lot of muscle mass. So in our last study where we did this was a diet break study in resistance trained females. They didn't lose any muscle mass or fat-free mass. All of their weight loss was from body fat stores. Some of our earlier studies also used 25%. Sometimes there was somewhat of a fat-free mass loss, but it's fairly good. It's better than, like I said, the standard of 25% out of the composition of weight loss. Let me move to the next point, which is where this study gets very intriguing. Ooh. And kind of is forcing me to maybe change my mind a little bit. So we also measured total body water, and none of the other studies did this that I'm aware of in lean people. They always do, there's a couple studies that showed there's significant losses of fat-free mass with severe diets, but they didn't measure total body water changes. And if you look at the bodybuilder case studies, there's about 10 of those that are currently published, or 8, soon to be another one. Only 2 that I'm aware of out of the 10 also measured total body water changes. So what we found was, just to review, a 0.5 kilogram of fat-free mass loss. And just to make sure everybody's on the same page, you have your body weight. We find out how much fat you've lost or how much fat you have. Everything else is fat-free mass, organs, water, soft tissue. It's not all muscle, but we all kind of agree if that changes, we don't expect our organ mass to change much. It can, but it doesn't change much. We don't expect our bone mineral density to change much in 2 weeks. So we kind of assume that these acute changes are because of contractile or actual muscle, skeletal muscle changes. So let's go with that assumption. When we factored in the amount of body water that was lost over the 2 weeks, it was 0.4 kilograms of water. So that means when you take out the water, which most of that would be in the fat-free mass tissue, because muscle mass is 70% water.
So
it would imply that there was only
of actual muscle.
What's it? Yes. Yeah.
Wow. What? And that's you're right, because no one looks at the fluid part, and you're right that is with glycogen, particularly in a severe deficit. When you have glycogen depletion, I'd imagine at a 50% deficit, probably in about 2-3 days, you'd probably almost max out glycogen stores. So that fluid shift largely accounts for most of the actual fat-free mass loss. So really, in this particular context, where you'd expect such a severe deficit to really strip muscle mass off, it's actually, when you factor in that variable that you guys have that you haven't seen in a lot of studies, you've actually realized that the rate of loss is actually very favorable. You've lost
4/5 of the total loss is actually just water, or the total muscle loss is actually water, not muscle tissue itself. Is pretty incredible. But Bill, this is, I've been involved in weight loss, especially women's weight loss, for about a decade now. I actually used to have a business called The Bride Buster. And the whole premise of that was that I would prep women for their weddings. And I did that for 5 years. I prepped women for their weddings. And essentially all I did was I took classic bodybuilding style prep and applied that to women who were getting ready for their weddings. And, in that 5-year period and continuing on after that for the next sort of 5 years, I learned a lot about weight loss and effective ways to help women lose weight. But in that period, I also came to the conclusion that if we lose weight fast, generally speaking, we will put it back on and then some. If we lose it slow, we've got a far better chance of keeping it off. And that's just purely anecdotal based on what I've seen in my girls. Now, you've come to this this number of 1% body fat loss per week would be an aggressive weight loss program. And I'm probably somewhere in the same field. I say to my girls, I like you to lose about 500 grams a week, which is a little bit more aggressive than what you're suggesting with your 1%. But I find if we lose any more than that, they almost always put it back on and then some. And I found it really, really hard because I have, people in the industry promising things like, multiple kilograms of weight loss per week. And, we see shows like Biggest Loser where people are losing, 15 kilos in a weigh-in and this sort of thing. And I think that the general opinion of the women that I've dealt with is when they come in and when we weigh them in and they've lost 500 grams, they're disappointed. You're like, oh, only 500 grams. But like me trying to explain to them, that's a lot of tissue. That's a lot of real material gone from your body right now. It's, I think changing that mindset is important. But do you think that there's any specific reasons, or have you experienced the same thing that I'm talking about? Do you think that there's specific reasons why when we lose weight slowly, we keep it off, and when we lose weight fast, we don't?
I do. And the way that I explain this, and I'm not an exercise psychologist, so I'm outside of my expertise here, but it makes sense to me that if you're taking a longer time to lose fat, you are more likely acquiring habits or behaviors that become habits. Whereas if you just throw yourself into this diet and are avoiding every possible food and doing 2 hours of cardio, you can't possibly maintain that when the diet is over, quote unquote, over. But if you were taking it slow, that's more sustainable. So I think what's happening is you're acquiring behaviors that become your lifestyle. And that's why it's easier. And something else to consider when we're talking with your past clientele, which I love, I used to be a personal trainer. My favorite client in the world was a bride-to-be. And it's funny. There are two people in the world who I say, lose weight slow, but there's two exceptions. One of those is bodybuilders if they have to step on stage on a certain date. And the other group is brides. They have to get married on a certain day. So, and also they have to fit into the dress that they've ordered, possibly 6 months earlier. And that was the biggest thing I found. They're all ordering dresses that are too small for them with the intention of fitting into it. Yeah. And to cut your teeth on that clientele, I mean, they're probably like the perfect subject in my language. So the other part of this is, and this is something that I tell my students, we are up against a tidal wave of unrealistic expectations. 30 pounds in 4 weeks is something that I see on the internet all the time, which is like 14 kgs in 1 month. It's like, you've got to be kidding me. So it's up to us as fitness professionals to say that is not realistic. And on our plan, or in my research, we're doing everything we can to actually work against you to lose any weight on the scale, because we're going to give you high protein. That's going to maintain muscle mass. We're going to ask you to lift weights. That's going to keep muscle mass. So everything about that does not encourage this scale to move. It encourages the scale to stay the same. And if it does move, like you said, 500 grams, we can feel very good that movement is in the exact body store that we want, which is fat. So I think this is a huge we have to educate on the front end. And as we get small changes, they're actually big changes in somebody's body and then how their clothes fit, et cetera. So that's my take on all of that.
That's an interesting space you just mentioned when you said, and I think it segues beautifully into probably your most recent and largest body of work being diet breaks, refeeds, and this particular area. Now, when you mentioned there, funnily enough, a lot of your research is actually trying to slow down that weight loss, or work against them, like you said, with the high protein diet, the resistance training. And this is such like golden data, because unlike a lot of research, which is on obese individuals or untrained individuals or the elderly with sarcopenia or, somewhat irrelevant demographics, our listeners are, thousands of gym owners, personal trainers. They own supplement stores. They're in the fitness industry. So these are people who are very much, you can apply your research to our listeners flawlessly. And one thing that I think a lot of people would get value from, because a lot of us particularly Stu and I coming from a bodybuilding background, we very much see the static caloric deficit as the, what's always been done. But I think there was some early pioneering with some people like Lyle McDonald in refeeds, I suppose, and looking at, singular versus multi-day. And I guess your recent research on the use of a diet break has been really interesting. And I thought I'd dive in and see, what is your thought? What are your findings on, I suppose, a static deficit for a period of time versus using intermittent diet breaks? And what did that do to that body composition change with fat-free mass or body fat? What did some of those? Let's dig into that.
Yeah, so we published a study last year on diet refeeds, and I'll define that. And we are about to submit a diet break study, probably in the next week or two. So when you'll have me back on in a couple months, and we can talk about the results of that one. I'd like to suggest that this the global term, or the umbrella term, is nonlinear dieting. So most people traditionally, they go on a diet and they stay on a diet for 3 months, 4 months. They never take a break. This concept of nonlinear dieting says that might not be the best strategy. Let's take some breaks in between here to prevent the negative adaptations that elongated dieting or severe dieting induce on the body. So the two terms that are typically used are diet breaks, which by definition in the research literature, or by application in the research literature, is usually typically 2 weeks of a complete break, sometimes more, even up to 6 weeks, where you stop dieting, go back to maintenance levels, which potentially could be a slight surplus, and then you go back on your diet. The other term is diet refeeds, which are the same concept. They're just looked at a little bit more acutely. And think of that, instead of weeks, think of that as days. So maybe a 1 day per week, or what we did was 2 days per week of increasing calories. And it's important to know the reason that they would be valuable is if the diet introduces negative adaptations. If the diet isn't severe enough, or if the diet isn't long enough, there's not much of a utility for diet breaks or diet refeeds, because you're introducing them to help solve a problem. And if the diet, again, isn't causing a problem, well, then they lack utility. Now, that doesn't mean they're still not valuable. I believe they are. And I also want to say that it looks like with the recent research, Dr. Jackson Payos did a phenomenal study on diet breaks. If you think that they are going to be offer you, let's just say, a huge advantage, I think you would be disappointed. It's not going to cause massive additional amounts of fat loss. There is some positives in the obese literature where that has been shown, but in these resistance training people, and my own research in this would confirm this. However, I would be cautious to say that they're not valuable at all. And I think you're going to start to see the industry trend, whoa, they don't help, so why would you do that? And where I think they're valuable is, one, psychologically, but two, not everybody's a bodybuilder that needs to hack the body to get a greater amount of weight loss. What if you just want to take a break for a week? What if you're going on vacation? What if you have a kid's birthday party? So for the lifestyle bodybuilder or the recreational bodybuilder, I think these things are they offer a tremendous amount of value. That's what I do in my own life. I live a diet refeed lifestyle where I diet Monday through Friday. I increase my calories on the weekend. Just real quick to talk about what we reported in our study last year that we published this, a diet refeed. We had one group of subjects diet for 7 weeks straight. The other group, we said, you're also going to diet for 7 weeks, but every weekend you're going to increase your calories in the form of carbohydrates. Now, to be fair, you're going to have to diet harder during the week because we want there to be a match between your deficit and the other group's deficit. And at the end of 7 weeks, the group that took diet breaks or diet refeeds 2 days in a row, increasing carbs, they had a significant retention of their muscle mass that when it was accounted for total body water, just like we did in our rapid fat loss study. So when that was controlled for, they retained that better. They also had a better retention of metabolic rate. And that makes a lot of sense because skeletal muscle is one of the primary determinants of metabolic rate. So if you keep more muscle mass, you're probably going to keep your metabolic rate from being suppressed as much.
Right.
So our data would suggest there is some value for the physique-minded individual using diet breaks or diet refeeds. And the diet break literature would say maybe not a benefit, but clearly no harm. I don't think you're going to find a study that says that they're harmful other than slowing down the process of weight loss. But you know my philosophy. I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to try to convince somebody to lose weight faster.
I believe that also led to, if I recall that particular study well also, doesn't it tend to trend towards also better long-term diet compliance, adherence, and I guess the rebound effect that we typically see in 95% odd people who have done a diet and who end up, probably above their previous set point. Does this have any sparing effects on that return to after dieting? Because I guess we've had probably a less intensive experience in that caloric deficit, possibly feeling a lot less restricted. Did you see, I guess, was there, like in that recent study you did where you said they actually said for the 2 weeks after their severe deficit, you said, do what you'd like. Did you look at the data in those subjects after the 2 weeks and what happened to their body weight with the 2 week period after those more severe deficits? Was that something that was looked at?
Yeah. We analyzed that. Now, to be honest, I still have more analyses to do, but the general analyses we've done, and what we found was after the 2 weeks, their fat-free mass was no longer, there was no significant loss of fat-free mass. And that also means the dry component, when we accounted for body water, no change at all. So within 2 weeks after the diet, even if you don't account for water, they returned their muscle mass back to baseline levels, approximately, at least not statistically different. So
wow.
You could say that if you take just a month approach, 2 weeks a diet hard, 2 weeks not diet as hard, that you don't lose muscle mass over that period of time. Now, I could be critical and say, well, that was still a month that you didn't gain any muscle mass. And that's a valid argument if you're working against this. But again, I think we're all sensitive to what's your goal. If your goal is to lose fat, let's pursue that. If your goal is to gain muscle, you're not going to go on a 37% caloric deficit. So
yeah, it's all
I think I've found in my, in my working with bodybuilders. So I've obviously worked with, bodybuilders, and I've also worked with just everyday people, especially women. I've had a lot to do with women's weight loss. For me personally, I've found that, with any of these concepts, they can be taken and misconstrued by the subject, especially with bodybuilders on this concept of refeeds. So what I've found is that with some of the guys who I've given refeeds to, they tend to then overemphasize the positive benefits of the refeed. And so they will then go way over the top on the refeeds, and we end up to a point where we actually start to push towards a surplus because, they think that these refeeds are so beneficial. So I think that, like, in my experience, there can be a risk of that as well, depending on how you presented the information to the user. For me, Bill, my methodology with my women, I still do women's weight loss every day. That's my bread and butter, is helping women lose weight and sustain weight loss long term. And something that I say to my women is, with any change that we make, whatever outcome you get from that change, you need to maintain that change to maintain the outcome. So with any change that you're going to make, you need to ask yourself, can I make this change for the next 30 years? Now, if the answer is no, then we don't make that change. We find a way around it, and we find some other change that we can make where they can answer yes to that question. But then that would again be on the opposite end of the spectrum and suggest no diet breaks. It just suggests a total lifestyle change. Like, do you feel that that would be a good approach, or do you think that there's some middle ground that is a better approach, or where would you stand on that?
And the approach would be what? The
approach would be to make permanent long-term changes. So if I'm going to make a change, I need to make that change for the next 30 years, and I need to do that all the time in order to maintain the result.
I love that. And I use the same philosophy with a different question. Yeah. Can you see yourself doing this? What you're doing today, can you see yourself doing that in the future? Just like you said, I love the 30-year time frame because that really impresses it upon the person. One caveat would be, I think I've come to the conclusion, if you're trying to live a life with an optimal physique, and at least this is true for me, I'm going to have to diet for the rest of my life at certain points. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to just stay on this path where I'm not really dieting. As I let off the reins a little bit, I tend to gain fat, but that's okay, because now I'm a scientist. I like to try things. So I almost see the people who aren't bodybuilders, but the people who are just trying to optimize their physiques, living most of their life not in a caloric deficit, but just knowing I'm going to have to get back on track at times and go on a diet. And that's where I hope that, the stuff we're talking about, the high protein, the resistance training, the diet refeeds, the diet breaks, all of that, the long-term approach, the moderate caloric deficits can help them get to where they want to be, and then it's the fun game of maintaining that. So
well, I think
agree with everything you said.
Exactly what you're saying is definitely true for myself anyway. I'll go through periods where I'll get a little bit fluffy, if you will. I'll have a little bit of extra pudge on, and I'll say, okay, well, it's time to grab the reins and get this ship back on course. But for me, when I see a little bit of body fat gain, there's no panic, because I know that I have 100% control of the process. I know exactly what I need to do to my body in order to get into whatever shape I want to get. If that means being sub 5% body fat on a bodybuilding stage, or it just means, being 12% body fat and looking half decent on the beach, I can do that. So I think that, like, some of this knowledge that you're giving and that you're sharing, that's really where the power lies, is in the knowledge. Because if you have the knowledge and the understanding of how to manipulate these things and how to take control of the ship, so to speak, all that fear is gone. And I think that's one of the biggest things I see in my girls, is this terrified fear. I think they feel like the body is that their body is somehow this machine that they have no control over, and they're at the whim of their body. If I eat this donut, am I going to blow out and get fat? I'm getting asked questions, Stu, should I drink water? Should I eat salt? Am I allowed to eat a grapefruit? These strange, obscure questions that it really nails home the fact that they have no idea how this machine that they're operating works. And so they feel totally out of control. Is that what you see in a lot of your subjects?
Not as much. And the reason that is because we implement a flexible dieting system. So one of two things happens. Either the subjects come to us already knowing about tracking their macros or a flexible dieting lifestyle. And if they don't, I have a large research team where we educate them on that quickly. Like they literally, all of my subjects have a personalized nutrition coach. That's how we were able to do these studies and get them to adhere. So it's a high level of support. But I do know in your world and in most people's world living, because I don't live in the real world, I live in a research lab where we're kind of, making sure they're educated. It's very frustrating to get those questions. But I guess with frustration comes opportunity. It's probably why you're a successful trainer. You're the one who's educating them on that. So me personally, no, only because of the world that I happen to be in academia and probably attracting a little bit more of an intelligent or nutrition educated type of subject who happens to be a university student.
I think I came to that realization this week. I had some back-to-back seminars this week and I had one yesterday, in fact, and it was really interesting because we're so fortunate, particularly on this podcast, we get to pick the brains of people like yourself. We've got, it's not often that I guess I gain perspective again. When I have these seminars to very much general population people, mums, dads, just, everyday people who are, and this particular one was with a popular gym franchise here. And we went through and got people to raise their hands with questions. And I suspect they're very basic questions. Things like, who in the room here sleeps between 7 to 8 hours a night? Raise your hand. In a room of 30 people, probably 4 raise their hand. Going down from there, the next group, who sleeps 4 to 6 hours a night? Probably 20 of the 30 put their hand up. Who sleeps less than 5 hours a night? The remaining of the group, probably eight-ish people put their hand up. We then went to food. And we went, okay, who eats 3 square meals a day? Don't even care about composition, just who eats 3 times a day? Probably 4 people. Next group of people was, who here gets in lunch and dinner, but skips breakfast and just gets a coffee? About 20 of the 30 again. So I guess my point with that, in doing this, with just a completely blind, questionnaire with just a room full of everyday people, is I've been disconnected because I think I've spent so much time talking around people like yourself, people in the industry. We often get a little bit, we have the luxury of talking to people who are, they have a background in this, they're educated in it. And you forget that to everyday people, sometimes kicking a goal is having 3 square meals a day. Like, let alone not tracking, not looking at macros, not resistance training. It's just, hey, can I sleep an extra hour a day? That's going to be the big pendulum mover. So I just found it really fascinating when you said that. You go, yeah, look, you're always in labs. Obviously, the people around you are honors students. They're people who are, they're definitely academics. So, we forget this sometimes. And I think it's good. It's really good that both of you made that point there. We've had a really nice little cross section there with Stu working with everyday people coming in off the street into his supplement store there, as well as the research science. And we're trying to put them together so our listeners can sort of take away bits that are relevant to them and things that are, at their level in their journey at this point. So, and to that end, I think looking at particularly where I wanted to really get some clear definition was with your refeed work, in particular, single day, multiple day, 2, 3, 4. Where would you say is the best advice for someone who's trying to optimize body composition, which is what a lot of our listeners are, people who are trying to maintain muscle mass best they can whilst dieting? Where's it sort of sit? Where's the best middle ground on the number of days to use? Maybe the change in caloric intake, or maybe the percentage of macros in those days. Could you give us some details and some metrics around what's the best structure for these refeeds that you've done some studies on?
Yeah, a debate is whether let's just say 1 to 3 days per week tends to be the discussion. Then after we decide, let's say 2 days per week, we're going to increase calories back to maintenance levels. Then it becomes, should they be back-to-back days or should we split them? And you can make an argument for splitting them and you can make an argument for keeping them together. In my study, we did them back-to-back on the weekends. Unless, a subject had an event come up where they could change their day. So it wasn't like they had to do it on the weekends, but that's what we encouraged, and that's what most of them did. I think what makes sense is the person's lifestyle, what makes sense for them. So we have research to suggest that people eat more food on the weekends. So I think it makes sense. If you naturally do that, let's design a diet that fits what you would naturally do, which is eat more food on the weekends. I could even make an argument. In fact, I probably will do this at some point as a personal experiment where my life will be a little bit of a deficit Monday through Friday, just so I can enjoy more food on the weekends, because I'm somebody, I absolutely just love food. I love that feeling. My wife laughs at me, like when I eat so much that I just like, it's painful. Like I like that. It's enjoyable to me. She's like,
You're in the right country for it, Bill. You're definitely in the right country for that then.
Yeah. Sad, but true. But yeah, I can't say that 2 days is better than one split, or like one day here, one day there, because we didn't research that. But 2 days to, at least in our research, we showed some clear benefits. And let me say, I am loving this conversation so much. This is exactly the stuff that I love to talk about: calories, deficits, fat loss.
Speaking of that probably is a good transition into something that I wanted to ask this episode, and I've been kind of waiting for a bit of an opportunity to question you on it a little bit. Something that I experience regularly is, I think that the three of us, having, looked at quite a lot of data and spoken to a lot of people over the years and whatnot, would agree that caloric intake is, or creating caloric deficit is the overwhelming factor in weight loss, right? But then you get some people who are like, no, weight loss is all about insulin, or weight loss is all about the endocrine. I want to pick your brain a little bit on hormones and the role that they play in weight loss. And I guess, where do the hormones stand in the weight loss? What
I'm so
part
glad.
do they play? How big of a part do they play?
So glad you went there, Stu. I'm really fascinated about this, because this is going to be really challenging for Bill, because he's going to have the academic hat where it's all about the data, but then there's also the nuances of things like the impacts of cortisol on body, on body flux, body composition changes, and the impacts of maybe like a slower thyroid function, or a suppressed metabolism, or insulin resistance. Or we're on the same page, Stu. This is exactly where I wanted to steer the ship at some point, because I want to see where this sort of fits into these otherwise pretty black and white studies. So go on, Bill. Where do these sort of nuances of hormonal influences, cortisol and thyroid function and what have you? Have you ever considered these in some of the research you've done, or or anecdotally even, do you see this in a lot of your subjects where it influences the shifts?
We've done very little blood work in my research, so I'm not speaking from my own lab's research. I would be speaking from my reading of other people's research, and more specifically, physique coaches that in my network that I have a lot of respect for. So I guess I have to admit my bias. I'm a macro scientist, essentially. I study diets and how they impact fat loss and muscle gain and all that stuff. So my largest funnel, or my first filter, is the caloric deficit. I think that is the largest portion of or the largest consideration. It should be the largest consideration.
Should be. Agreed.
100%. Yeah. Caloric deficit. I don't think anyone who is educated in this field would disagree that caloric deficit is the overwhelming factor, right?
Right. And then where I start to possibly disagree with some other people, some people will say, some people that I have a lot of respect for, it's all caloric deficit all the time. If you're not losing weight, then you're not in a caloric deficit. I have trouble with that statement. I think for 90% of the people, yes, they're probably lying about what they're eating. They aren't in a caloric deficit. But what about the people who truly are in a caloric deficit and they are not losing body fat? There's too many of them. And again, too many meaning, I don't mean a majority of the population, but there's too many anecdotal coaches that come to me swearing that this client is being truthful. I can't just say I don't believe you, because that's what I'd be saying. And then what? Well, I think that the caloric deficit is the driver. It directs the orchestra. So the hormones follow the deficit. I don't think the hormones are the puppet master, so to speak, dictating things. So where this gets tough and where I don't have an answer, and I might rely more on you guys if you're working with subjects and getting blood work. What do you do when you know you're in a caloric deficit for a period of time? You've got to, there's natural plateaus. So you can't just give it a week. I'd say a month where you're grinding and caloric deficit, exercising, and fat's not coming off. And then you get blood work, or you have blood work, and it would suggest, wow, there's problems. Reverse T3 is very high. That's somebody I've been working with recently. She was having a lot of difficulty. And this is somebody I've worked with in the past, so I have a high level of trust, and she was not losing fat. So we got blood work. Reverse T3 was high, so now I'm looking into that. Sometimes cortisol is high, but I have not seen, at least in my research, we've looked at cortisol just a few times. It's generally not elevated with, at least in my subjects in dieting. So I'll just say I don't have answers, but I don't discount that hormones have a role. I just, and then it's an area that I hope to learn more about going forward. But
it's really interesting.
Bill, anecdotally in the people that I've dealt with, I found, this is funny, but when I first started personal training, I was dealing primarily with men. Okay. And I found that with men, we seem to work a little bit more like a computer, right? I put in, the information I think, and we spit out the data I expect. It's kind of with men, when I was working with them, things were a lot more predictable, and the things that I had learned in my education in nutrition and all that stuff, they worked almost universally for men. And so when I started this bride buster business, and I started working with these women and prepping them for their weddings, I went into that process thinking that I was the Yoda of weight loss. I already knew it all, and I had a system. That I pretty much universally applied to men, and it almost always worked very well. And when I started applying that same system to women, I found that sometimes it was working well, or a lot of times it was, but a lot of times it wasn't, or at least more often than in men, it wasn't. And so what I did was I went back to my biochemistry days, and I started looking a little bit further into hormones. And I discovered that there was a couple of hallmarks for those women who I wasn't seeing the results in. And they were always, generally speaking, issues with either estrogen production, testosterone production, cortisol production, or one of the thyroid hormones was out of whack. And if we could get them to balance their hormones, whether that be through pharmaceuticals or through dietary changes or through different supplementary changes, I could generally then apply my systems and they would work. And I've been kind of running with that now for the past decade. And especially in my area, I've become kind of known as some sort of a weight loss magician. Like I'm the guy who can take weight off you when no one else can. And it's not that I'm doing anything really special, I just find that if I apply a caloric deficit to someone whose hormones are balanced, I get a far better outcome than if I apply a caloric deficit to someone whose hormones are imbalanced. And that's definitely what I've found in my years of helping people lose weight.
It certainly used to vex me because I used to get quite bogged down in the minutiae of things like the hormonal responses to food, touching on insulin, for example, nutrient timing, and looking at the influences of these things. And I think where I came to how I bridge the gap now between, I guess, looking purely at a calorie deficit being the main funnel, I suppose, or the main lens to view dieting from. I think where the maybe elevated cortisol might come in, or maybe higher than usual reverse T3, say, with some hypothyroidism, or some metabolic adaptations and things. I think where I put it in my head as being most impactful is it's all about calories in, calories out, but your output is very much responsive to, for example, your thyroid function. And so I sort of try and remedy the two and let them meet in the middle, going, okay, it still is about universally a calorie deficit. But for example, Bill, in some of your studies, you looked at people who are going, very much in severe diets, and you've seen like you've said, metabolic adaptations. Let's walk through some of that in your research. What extent do you see suppression of baseline basal metabolic rate in some of your research, Bill, around people in more, higher level caloric deficits? Because this might actually, we might be able to infer some things, that might not be as, viewed from a different lens, might not be there. So what have you seen in, metabolic adaptations? What's the realms that we see when that, in a dieting framework where that moves?
Yeah, so in our most recent, the rapid fat loss study that we started our conversation with, after the 2 weeks, even though dry fat-free mass, the fat-free mass that where we accounted for water, even though that didn't go down, we still had a significant, which was a 6% reduction in resting metabolic rate after the 2-week diet period. Now, that probably, and I can't say it for sure, but just the fact that they had reduced calories, there's a concept known as energy flux. So if you increase your calories, your metabolic rate goes up. If you decrease your calories, your metabolic rate goes down. So I would suggest that's probably a response to just being lower calorie, because it wasn't likely due to the loss of dry fat-free mass, as we talked about. In that diet break study that we're going to be publishing hopefully later this year, that was a 6-week diet, 25% caloric deficit, I think 2 grams or 1.8 grams of protein, 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass. We had no suppression of metabolic rate. In fact, resting metabolic rate, it didn't go up significantly, but it went up, 2 or 3% over the course of the 6-week diet. So that was very interesting.
Wow, it increased really in a
not significant. Yeah,
wow.
Not significantly.
But it didn't go down, which is what you'd expect.
It did not go down. And remember, that was also a study where they lost no fat-free mass. All of the weight lost was body fat, so they didn't lose their more active body tissue. In the diet refeed study, that was a 7-week diet. That was a 25% caloric deficit on average. We had I don't remember the percentage, but it was 80 calories per day in the group that didn't take the refeeds, and only 40 calories per day in the group that did have the refeed. So that becomes 40 calories.
Yeah.
That's negligible. I mean, you do 2 tests in a row, you're going to get a 40 calorie difference.
So what did you see? And now we're really in the weeds of it. I think we circled back beautifully to where we got quite excited before. Is the I guess then the beneficial effects. We're talking about metabolic adaptations to diets. We're talking about different diet strategies. So far, we've touched on diet breaks as a good strategy. Back into the refeed phase now. So in those, we briefly touched on it before when you were saying 2 days seems to be the I guess the place. What sort of benefits do we find when employing a 2-day diet break for starters? And then the second part to that is I really want to know if there was a difference in benefits from that refeed when it was done on carbohydrate primarily, which is what it sounds like you did, versus other macronutrients, a protein or slightly higher fats or higher protein. Was there any benefit at all to increasing calories from other macronutrients too? So 1, benefits of the diet break in that time frame, and 2, are those benefits only there when it's from carbohydrates versus other macronutrients?
Yeah, but who wants to refeed on protein, Will? Give me the cakes.
Carnivore diet.
Yeah, I can't comment on what would happen if it were protein or fat because we didn't look at that. But the reason we chose carbohydrates was there was some prior research in premenopausal women where 3-day carbohydrate refeed significantly increased leptin levels. So that was our rationale for a 2-day back-to-back. One of the theories, though, or hypotheses that we suggested in terms of why they didn't lose as much muscle mass in that study was obviously carbs increase insulin production. So if you have 2 days of higher carbohydrate intake, that means we're going to assume then a higher insulin production for 2 solid days. And one of the benefits of elevated insulin is it suppresses muscle protein breakdown. So that was the outcome variable that we observed. We just didn't measure insulin. We didn't measure muscle protein breakdown, but the endpoint variable was there. So it makes sense that at least we would hypothesize that it could have possibly been from an elevated insulin presence or insulin concentration for 2 consecutive days.
Sure. And what was that percentage? Sorry, on those macronutrients. So on these days where we're hitting, I'm assuming these are to clarify listeners as well. So we're not saying go out and refeed. Just go. We're not saying go nuts. Eat. These are very controlled, refined environments, and I suppose we're eating to. I'm going to assume caloric maintenance. Bill, is that the sort of framework typically? Gotcha. So
that's exactly what. Yeah.
Caloric maintenance.
We had them during their 2-day refeed. They could not eat more calories than what they were eating at baseline. And we had them increase their calories, all in the form of carbohydrates. Now, one could say, since your metabolic rate is decreasing over 7 weeks of dieting, when you go back to maintenance, technically it could be a slight surplus that you're actually eating. And that's a viable opinion and may actually be the reality. But yeah, I think a lot of people in the field, they say diet break or diet refeed, but they're really doing a cheat meal or cheat day, and they're actually in a significant caloric surplus.
Yeah,
we didn't research that.
That's what I've seen, and that's the fear of mine with introducing these refeeds, is that once you kind of let the cat out of the bag, it goes crazy and you can't get it back in the bag. So you let some of these bodybuilders have a little bit of something that they've been craving, and all of a sudden that you can't stop them. And I think that's probably the biggest fear. I'd like to just on your point about doing the refeeds with carbohydrates as well. I think something that I would suggest is a benefit, aside from just the fact that we are going to be producing more insulin, potentially driving more glycogen into the muscles and all that sort of thing, is the fact that people tend to crave carbohydrates over other macronutrients. The foods that we crave are generally the carbohydrates, right? So if you're looking at that, that psychological, I've got what I needed. I think that for me anyway, the carbohydrates are the ones that I'm going to want to go for. And that's when I'm going to really feel like I've had a true diet break, when I'm getting those things that I might've been craving for the last 7 days that I've been depriving myself of, or the last 5 days or whatever it might be that I've been depriving myself of. So I think that there's probably definitely some benefit to it being carbohydrate as the macronutrient as well there.
What was the percentage, out of curiosity, Bill, when you were doing these multiple day ones? Was it sort of 40, 40, 20? Was it, I guess, percentage of carbohydrate relative to other macronutrients? Did you drop protein or drop fats on those days, and make it a larger percentage? Because I've seen some really interesting stuff where people have gone as high as 60, 70% carbohydrate on these days, drop the other 2 macros down a little bit, knowing there's that, muscle sparing effect anyway of carbohydrate. So protein in a 48-hour period really isn't all too relevant. You've got the MPS stimulation coming from that insulin and mTOR anyhow. So what sort of percentage did you play with in your studies? That recent data, Bill. What sort of realm were you looking at with the carbohydrate?
We kept we required that they keep their protein the same the entire 7 weeks. And again, I think it was either 1.6 or 1.8 grams per kg. So there wasn't a ton of movement there was actually no movement in protein. That was stable. So we just said whatever the difference was, it needs to come from carbohydrates. I don't remember the exact macronutrient breakdown, but I can say, because this is almost always the standard across all of our weight loss studies, it's all about almost always a third carbs, protein, and fat during the caloric deficits in terms of the macronutrient composition breakdown. Proteins, you almost always about 30 to 33%, carbs right around there as well.
Yes.
And again, we're not trying to hit that. We're just saying eat high protein. And when you eat high protein and reduce your calories, they've got to come from somewhere.
Yeah, it just falls into place, doesn't it? And I think that we found, to infer from some other data, from some other other studies, I think it tends to fall pretty much that protein is the main influential player in the room. I think with and it seems to be carbohydrates and fats are somewhat interchangeable. A lot of respect. A lot of people that I follow and respect seem to say the same sort of things. As long as it's isocaloric and protein is accounted for it, as being the like you said, somewhere in that realm of the 1.6, even 2 grams per kilo, and some on the top end, but somewhere in that realm. Typically, they don't seem to see much changes in body composition where they do go the slightly higher fat, lower carb, or vice versa. It just seems to fall that way for some reason. They're not as influential as the protein part of the puzzle. Did you, and on that note, have you done in any of your research or those of colleagues of yours, have you looked into things like, I guess, when protein isn't quite that high, what that does to, I guess, the influences of these refeed periods? Does it change much if you're in a less high protein environment, which I guess is probably what you'll see a lot in general population, people who aren't bodybuilders and aren't people who are already accounting for this. If you're a normal person walking off the street and you're starting a diet, your normal diet probably isn't all that, isn't up around that 1.6 grams per kilo. So have you done much or read much study in this area for dieting without a high protein backbone to it, and what that does to body composition alternatively?
There's just in general, there's almost no research looking at weight loss in people who aren't overweight, which I guess is surprising. I want to say, I think at this point, now we haven't published them all, but I don't think anybody's done more than my lab in this area, especially as we're going to have 3 more studies coming out over the next year and a half. There are the few studies that exist in lean people or athletes, in this case, low protein diets, they did not preserve lean muscle mass. When you go to the obesity research, there the data becomes quite voluminous, where higher protein diets not only help retain muscle mass, they actually cause a greater amount of fat loss. So there's plenty of studies. And in my own lab, I can't even comment on it because it's something we never even looked at. We've always said we're going to feed you high protein. Now, we have done a high versus low protein study in resistance trained females, but that was not a dieting study. That was just, we're trying to put on muscle mass on these girls. So we've done it, but not in a dieting scenario.
Just out of curiosity, Bill, with these studies, do you use supplemental protein at all, or is it all real foods, the protein sources?
Yeah, so what we do is offer, depending on the study, we always offer post-workout protein, whey protein isolate. And that way we know that they're helping. We're doing everything we can to make sure that they get their protein. And then we take a note if they took it or not. In some of our studies, like right now, we're doing a protein tracking versus an intuitive eating study. And in that study, we're requiring that they have, because we're telling them to eat a lot of protein, 2.2 grams per kg. So requiring is a strong word. We don't throw them out of the study if they don't, but we literally say, here's your 2 scoops, go ahead and drink it so we can check it off. So we're highly encouraging. But if they can get their protein from food, then that's fine. But that's very hard to do.
Especially without blowing out your calories, right?
Yes. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. And this is a way that you can do, it's the most efficient way to do it. So I would say the answer to the question is we always offer it, and sometimes it's just short of requiring it.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Do you yourself supplement with protein, Bill?
Yes. Yeah. I would not be able to, I try to get 2.2 grams per kg. That would be very difficult for me without protein bars and protein shakes. And typically 1 or 2 protein bars a day and 1 to 2 protein shakes a day. That helps me get there.
Yeah, certainly, because it is for and again, going back to this week's seminar, for example, with more general population people, I think we do have to put it in the realm of the everyday folk. I think it is relevant to look at what's practical. Are you going to eat a kilo of chicken breast a day? As a normal person walking off the street, probably not. Hey, so it's also good to make this stuff relevant to the average person. But let's switch gears a smidgen there, because you've also done some really fascinating research around not just the purely the fat loss stuff. I want to look also at, I guess, the muscle mass side of things as well. Now, and particularly, I think one area recently that's been looked at a lot, like, you've got people in the industry like Dr. Eric Helms, who does some amazing research and advocates for more probably similar to you but in a surplus sense, in that he advocates for a very slow, very steady surplus with very, with the expectation that muscle gain is such a slow process, and you don't need that many calories to fuel it. In your studies, have you done many that focus on muscle gaining versus fat loss? And I guess I'd really love to see.
I know where you're going with this, Will, because I was looking at Bill's page the other day with some of those exciting muscle gain results.
Yeah,
that we didn't expect to see.
There's some great little infographics on your wall that you've posted recently, and I really want to look at, switch gears, not just to fat loss, because a lot of our listeners are also, there are a lot of guys with a bodybuilding background, or they're just people who really want to improve body composition. So dive into the muscle mass side of things, mate. Have you, I guess rates of, realistic rates of muscle gain and ways to optimize it? What are some of the findings you've had recently?
So that I've never researched that. I've always been on the fat loss side of this. And that's where, I appreciate Dr. Helms, he's such a thought leader in our field. So I learn a lot from him. I'll just comment on the one study that we did, which really reinforces higher protein intakes. We had aspiring female physique athletes, and what that meant was females who had either competed in a physique competition within the last 2 years or were planning to do so in the next year. And we gave them a high versus low protein diet. Those in the low protein diet ingested 0.9 grams per kg. Those in the high protein diet ingested 2.5 grams per kg. And what we found was probably not surprising, but a significant increase in muscle mass, lean or fat-free mass in the high protein group. They gained about 2.1 kgs over 8 weeks.
Wow.
And the other group,
that's huge. Wow. 2 kilos in 8 weeks.
Yeah.
In female, wow. Yeah, right. That's huge.
Aspiring female physique athletes. Now, that means they were resistance trained, but that not all of them were seasoned veterans. So keep that in mind. I would say a little bit more in the beginning stages, because you don't have to be an advanced lifter to compete as a bikini competitor. So keep that in mind. But they gain more muscle than in any of our male, I guess they've been more powerlifting studies. They gain more muscle mass than I've ever found in any of my other studies with males.
That's huge.
One limitation, though, we did not have a body water device at that time. So I can't sit here and say, yep, that was all muscle. What if they did have a retention of water? Now, I don't think it would have been more than what would have been expected. But we did not control for that, which now we would be able to control for that.
Yeah, certainly.
How do you guys measure this stuff, Bill? How do you guys measure the retained water and all that sort of thing? What is it that you're using to measure that in your studies?
Yeah, so body composition in general, we use A-mode ultrasound to measure body fat, and then we use a 2-compartment model. So that tells us the body fat, and then everything else is fat-free mass. So ultrasound is our body composition device. And then for body water, we use a validated MF or multi-frequency BIA, bioelectrical impedance analyzer. It's an InBody 570.
Yep.
And what's nice about that is it also will estimate intra versus extracellular body water. Now, we don't report on that, but the methods that they use are highly validated to assess body water. They use something called sodium bromide in their validation. So we feel very good. Now, it's not my favorite machine. It also will tell you body fat percentage. I don't like it for that because those machines are designed to measure body water. That's what they're designed. So while they'll give you body fat percentage, they're actually estimating body water, and then from that, they're estimating body fat percentage. Where with ultrasound, you're literally measuring the thickness of the fat layer under the skin. Like you're measuring fat. You're not estimating it based on something else. So yes. I love ultrasound. I even like skin folds for the same reason. Skin folds, what are you pinching? Fat. So you're measuring fat. I like that for the type of research that we do.
Yeah, certainly. And for anyone here, I guess the equivalent, so in the InBody 570 scanners are what you'll see quite often in, if you're lucky enough to have a supplement store near you, that's where a lot of the guys who really, I mean, they're probably in Australia anyway. They're probably about a 30 grand machine, so they're not a cheap machine. So people who not yeah, as you know, funding would suck to get a few of those. But but between body composition on a DEXA, by the sounds of it, is sort of the gold standard. That's the ultrasound, and usually a bioimpedance scan. So if anyone's gone to their local supplement store or and use one of these like an in-body 570 machine, that's sort of what we're using as the ways to measure these metrics. So I guess the muscle retention during is another really interesting part of your research. I guess a lot of your you've really that's where your research has been differentiated from a lot of other people, is that you're looking at muscle retention during dieting, which in obese individuals and so on isn't too much of a concern typically. So a lot of the studies in fat loss really aren't trying to keep someone really jacked while dieting. It's not really too much of a focus. So we've got a rare opportunity to ask you questions around that. So when do you see, I suppose, the best muscle retention in a dieting scenario? Did you find the difference between that 7-week static caloric deficit and versus the one with diet breaks, just versus the refeed? Because I didn't quite pick out enough on the diet break scenario. Was there much of a positive influence on fat-free mass difference and on muscle retention in the diet breaks versus a static deficit as well? Did you see that there was was there even a gain potentially in muscle mass during that week at maintenance? Was there not as much loss at the very least? What was the findings around the muscle in that stage?
And you're talking about the diet refeed study, the one
more the diet breaks. Sorry, because we had a good little look there at the refeeds, but I think we sort of skimmed over your diet break scenario, because I think that's really valuable as a lifestyle hack for a lot of people who get that diet fatigue, get that attrition, and it's a really great way. It's something that people could, listening to this podcast, can go home and start Monday and trial themselves. And I'd love to see what that does in real world data though. In your recent studies, what did it do for muscle mass? What did it do for percentage of loss? Alternatively, what were some of the findings around it? Using a diet break versus static.
Yeah. So overall, and I don't remember the specific numbers, unfortunately, but they did not lose muscle or fat-free mass. One thing that I was really curious about with that study, which I think could potentially scare a lot of people away, was what happens during the diet breaks. A lot of people would be scared, am I going to gain a kilogram or 2 kilograms over this 1 week? And we found no, you actually do not gain. I mean, you gain a little bit. It was like a third of a kg,
yep.
Or like half a pound in my country. So even though you're reducing or increasing your calories for a whole week, it didn't and some subjects lost body weight during that week, some gained, but on average, it was like a quarter or a third of a kg. So that was one thing that stuck out.
Wow.
The fat-free mass, if there was any lost, it was negligible. Definitely was not even close to a significant loss. It was one of those studies where we said, hey, this is a nice, and these were resistance trained females who in theory have a little bit more muscle mass to lose than they definitely had more than your average female. And something else I'm beginning to realize, and I'm going to explore this a little bit further, females definitely are able to maintain their muscle mass better than males when dieting. There's what I'm about prepared. I'm soon going to say it's a pretty clear difference that they are able to retain it. And you could ask, well, why? Well, one could be they have less muscle to lose. They don't have as much. The second one, their testosterone isn't being suppressed much. They don't have much testosterone to suppress. So those are two reasons possibly why females are able to retain muscle mass better than males.
So we see that anecdotally as well with recompositioning as well, just in it, like in more so, I guess more Stu and my realm, where we'll see it in whether it be a particular weight loss challenge that a gym or a studio or a supplement store might host. We'll see, weight transformations with people, and I've seen recomposition happen a lot more in female athletes where you'll see their scale weight might look like it's stalled over 4 weeks. Then you throw them on an in-body and scan them, and it looks like they've gained muscle, they've dropped body fat more than most males will expect to gain on a cycle. Like it's really remarkable to see, the results a lot of these women are getting. Is there, I suppose do you see in your studies like recompositioning happen much with do you find that females have an ability to gain muscle in a deficit more so than males? Because purely anecdotally, I seem to have come across it a lot. I don't know why, but it happens a lot. I put it down to estrogen being proliferative, having a protective effect on mass through that mechanism. Not sure, but have you seen where females have actually grown muscle in a calorie deficit in your studies?
No, not a significant amount. Where I have seen it once, but it wasn't a dieting study. This was that aspiring female physique study where we gave high versus low protein. The females, this is fascinating. The females in the high protein group, again, they got 2.5 grams per kg. They gained the 2 kgs of muscle mass over 8 weeks, and they lost a significant amount of body fat compared to baseline. So their body fat levels went down, but their overall caloric intake was up by nearly 300 calories. So,
wow. And I suppose the critical factor as well, Will, is in those recomposition changes that you're talking about. All of the participants are doing hypertrophy training, and in Bill's studies, probably none of them are, except for obviously this one where they were looking at aspiring physique athletes. Generally, you would assume that most of those were doing hypertrophy training. So I dare say that that is the factor that's going to play the biggest impact on those kind of muscle gain results. Protein intake and hypertrophy training. If we're looking at individuals who aren't doing any kind of hypertrophy, we won't expect to see significant increases in muscle mass, right, Bill?
Say that one more time. If they're not
doing any kind of hypertrophy training, we wouldn't expect to see much increase in muscle mass or any.
Well, we did a few powerlifting studies in the past, which was very squat, deadlift, bench press, very focused on them. And there were increases in fat-free mass, maybe around a kg, if my memory serves me correctly. We published those studies multiple years ago. Something else to consider too, not just my research, but anybody doing research, we supervise every workout. So these subjects are coming in. If they don't show up, we know it, and they know that we know. So there's almost a little bit of I'll just say a steroid effect, even though it's not a steroid effect. It's a little bit biased in favor of results than what you're going to see in a general clientele, because your clients they're living their lives. We all want to admit that our clients never do this, but we assume our clients show up and do their workouts, but maybe some of them don't, and they might not tell us. But in my studies, again, any researcher who's supervising the workouts, you're getting an amplified response because of the fact that they're simply not missing any workouts. Their intensity is going to be higher. And we train our staff. I train my staff, like they need to take this to near failure. So let's also appreciate, again, not just mine, any research that supervises the workouts. It's probably not fair to compare that to what our clients would expect to get. And I fail to mention that a lot of times, but so does everybody else. It is another consideration.
Yeah, but that's fantastic though, because otherwise, how do you control that variable, which is so big? Because even looking at that from a calorie burn perspective, looking at it from the quality of training, is actually a variable you don't often. I didn't hear about being mentioned a lot either, and I often wondered that, because there's a big difference between Joe Blow going to a local gym, doing 2 or 3 sets of curls, and then going home, versus a supervised training in a lab environment where and standardizing it the best you can. That's really quite that's great to hear. That's a controlled variable in this one. And I guess now to synthesize a lot of what we've spoken about with breaks, refeeds, looking at versus a static deficit for a period of time. If someone was to come to you and go, okay, Bill, based on your experience, what is the gold standard approach for if you were going to construct the ultimate, I suppose, fat loss guide in your scenario, I guess, are we talking, in let's just put a time frame. In 12 weeks, you have to move as much body fat as possible, whilst hopefully maintaining as much muscle as possible. What are we doing? Are we doing a combo of, some refeeds, some diet breaks? What would you throw at this person if they come to you and say, Bill, I need to move as much muscle as possible. As much body fat as possible. I want to keep muscle. We've got 12 weeks, mate. Let's really have a go at this. What structure would you take? How would you structure that weight loss protocol?
Yeah, I wouldn't assume any diet breaks in 12 weeks, but I would definitely incorporate them if they reach a plateau. So a plateau at a minimum of 2 weeks without losing any body weight or any body fat, maybe 3 weeks or 4 weeks. But I wouldn't assume 12 weeks, let's do one diet break every month. Because the question is, what can we do to maximize fat loss and keep his muscle mass? I would do periodic refeeds just because that helped to retain muscle mass better in our study. And that was the only study that I'm aware of in resistance trained people. So I want to be careful that I'm not overly reliant on my lab's data, but it is the only one we can rely on. So I'm not going to disregard it either. And I think there's it's a concept of, I would want you to be as aggressive as you can on your caloric deficit without causing an elevated hunger response. So let me talk through that for a moment. If I'm cutting my calories 10%, the fact that I'm dieting in my head, well, now I'm hungry. But what if I cut it by 20% and my hunger is the same? Well, then 20% is better than 10%, because if my hunger is no different, I'm going to lose more fat. So I'm kind of changing my approach on this. I want to maximize the deficit and minimize the hunger. So somewhere in there, there's going to be a point somewhere too where the deficit's so much that now hunger is, almost extrapolated to a much larger degree. And we don't want to do that.
Oh, it's a very big bell curve, very big bell curve. It's a very defined tipping point. And to put it in like a calorie term, I tend to find that probably anything over about a 750 calorie deficit, so for me, that's losing about 3/4 of a kilo per week or so. So probably about 1.5 pounds a week sort of thing, is about where I really find that it starts going, hunger versus, actual effects of the diet versus just doing, a 500 calorie deficit, say, or a 250 cal deficit. You're dead right. There is definitely that tipping point where you go, if I even look at a bag of chips wrong, this is going to get messy.
Oh, that's something else too. Just the processed foods. I've been really intrigued by that, and I like processed foods. Like I really like potato chips. But when I'm dieting, at least for this, I'm in the midst of a diet right now. I've pretty much told myself I will not do that. Like, I know it's not going to help my hunger as much as I like potato chips or ice cream. Because I'm focused on fat loss, I'm just going to put it to the side for these 10 weeks because I know I'll be much more fuller with that. And I've been reading, I just read another study recently to suggest these ultra processed foods, just that they are not
satiating.
They're not your friend when dieting.
Yeah, that's something I say to a lot of my girls as well, is when they say, Stu, what should I be eating? Because I don't write them a specific diet. I use a little bit of flexible dieting, but I tend to say to them, if the food looks the way that it came off the animal or the way that it came out of the ground, it's probably okay. And that's kind of my rule of thumb for them. If it looks the way that it looked when it came off the animal, or if it looks the way that it looked when it came out of the ground or off the tree, it's probably okay. You can probably have that, and for my girls anyway, I found that rule of thumb to work very well.
Yeah, I think even from a satiating effect, I think the hypercaloric foods with particularly and most of those you seem to have a higher percentage of fats and higher sodium. The hyperpalatability of that food tends to come into play versus the satiating effects. And I think so we're going to throw in circling to this regimen, I suppose. So we're going to scrap the diet breaks because we're going to go in more of an acute campaign and try and really drive that fat loss. Now the refeeds you'd throw in, we're going to look at, would you in this particular case, for the best bang for buck, you sort of point out probably a 2-day, 3-day at maintenance calories refeed primarily from carbohydrate. That'd be your average.
Yeah, I think what I would do, knowing that, again, the question is maximize fat, but let's try to maintain muscle. I'd probably use it every other week instead of every week because I'd want to lose more fat.
Sure.
And I would do back to back just because that's what my lab did. But that's, again, I can't say that splitting, maybe one per week would be like every Saturday. That's another option there. In fact, maybe that's what I would do.
Definitely include some supplemental protein in there, right?
Oh yeah. For me, yeah, I eat a lot of chicken breast, but there's only so much chicken breast that I want to eat in a day.
Yeah, which in itself is a very real thing. The single day, I was thinking back to some when I knew you were coming on, I did some early reading with Lyle McDonald's work. He was probably one of the guys who really started looking at this a little bit earlier in the piece. And I think there was definitely more of a much stronger tendency to have heaps better data from doing 2, 3, 4 day refeeds. They found that singular day refeeds didn't seem to have a protective enough effect or like a restorative effect on your metabolic adaptations as much as doing it for multiple days. Have you got that quantified anywhere in any of your studies? Have you seen anywhere where you've done a single day versus multi, and I guess how much of an influence that has doing them a several day refeed versus singular?
No, we haven't. The only thing we did, which wasn't very helpful, we just did metabolic rate before and then after the 7-week diet period. But what you're asking would be the next logical step, along with leptin measurements. That's what's metabolic rate going into the refeed and leptin levels after a period of dieting. What is metabolic rate and leptin the day after the refeed? I think that makes, those would be the next questions that naturally my lab would look at if we were to focus on diet refeeds for sure.
Yeah, certainly. No, I just really am fascinated by that because we in this circle where we have a lot of people who are friends of ours that are coaches, trainers who deal with hundreds of people. We get a pretty decent I guess anecdotal data on people seeing these shifts, and I think using it myself in a recent sense, in building up to this, I thought I'll attempt a diet break myself, and I'm doing sort of cyclical refeeds as well weekly. And I've done singular, like non-consecutive days, and I've done them back to back as well. And anecdotally, at least, there seems to be a really significant effect on particularly the 2-day. I've done 3 as well, but it had to be a bit more moderate on the calories because the weekly calorie balance otherwise wouldn't quite work out as well. So I could be a little bit more aggressive with the 2 days because I was still in a deficit weekly. I could sort of, so those days looked like over 4,000 calories on those 2 days. I put it at. So a really nice refeed day. But I definitely found a difference, at least in my N=1 scenario, where doing, 2 days consecutively versus, split ones throughout the week did seem to have things like a noticeable increase in body temperature. My NEAT increased as well. So my daily steps went up significantly without me trying to, which was a really, really interesting part. And I guess that made me pay really close attention to standardizing NEAT in these things, which is luckily now becoming a bigger thing for trainers. But do you sort of track, step counting in particular and things like that for any of your clients, any subjects in your studies to see if they're
we have not. We've only gone to the extent in some of our studies, not all of them, which is to get them to track the time that they've been doing their exercise. But no, I mean, we supervise their workouts, their resistance training workouts. And if there's a cardio component, we don't supervise that. So we have not gone to that extent. And I philosophically, I look at my research as helping not people stepping on a bodybuilding stage, not helping obese individuals, but clearly they can benefit from my research, but I'm not really serving them. I'm serving this group of people who are fit, who have an educated view of nutrition and who like to exercise. And I'm sensitive to the fact I don't want them to have a life of tracking everything. So I'm even struggling. I've been tracking my sleep, but I'm like, man, do I really want to track that too? Because I track my macros. And now, I'm even, one of the studies we're doing now is we're having our subjects just track protein. Like, we don't care about your carbs or your fat. So I would say my philosophical purview is, yes, we should track some things if you care about your physique, but let's be careful that we're not obsessive where your entire life is a tracking life.
Yeah, certainly. And that's an interesting part too, I guess, bring it to real world as well? Because a lot of our, probably 90% of our listeners are that exact demographic you described. A lot of them have competed and do actively compete, but also a lot of them are people like Stu and myself, say, who have competed previously, but now are in a place where we've got, there's kids in the equation. There's also partners. There's a lifestyle as well that we're trying to have some balance in. So I guess ideally, where would you just, personally, where would you like to see, like, for someone, like I really enjoy geeking out with and tracking everything. I do the same thing. I'll track steps, I'll track sleep, I track macros, because I just love running that science experiment personally. I like guinea pigging myself. But it does get into a point where you do, like, outside looking in, it seems very obsessive. I just like running myself as a constant experiment and seeing what happens when REM sleep goes up or down, or steps go up, NEAT goes up or down, or calories manipulate, or macros, whatever. So for yourself, who's someone who's obviously very interested and passionate in this area and loves that, and it's all about data collection, obviously, where do you think is, I guess, where do you see your personal approach to, what do you think is more ideal, I suppose, for someone, what would be your ideal approach for someone who's trying to have, much like our listeners, a bit of a balance in their lifestyle where they're not constantly obsessing over it, but maybe some sort of take home points they can sort of look at and go, look, if you're trying to maintain a decent body composition, have a good amount of muscle, but not, hopefully go too fluffy, I guess, is it towards that intuitive eating side that you lean? Do you more say, maybe just account for protein and you'll probably sit in an okay range? Where would you sort of, what's your personal opinion on what you think looks pretty decent for someone trying to maintain a not too crazy lifestyle of control and tracking?
Yeah, on the realm of intuitive eating, I think that's the goal, what I call the utopia, but I think it's being a little overplayed currently.
It
doesn't work for me. I intuitively overeat. If that's what happens.
I don't see how it can work. I don't know. Like, intuitive eating to me, in a period now where people are quite often over caffeinated, overstressed, overworked, a lot of people there's hyper palatable foods, there's calorie density in different foods massively. Like, if you intuitively eat on a meal, with more fat sources, say, like, even add, things like, your more oils or nuts, or, like a peanut butter sandwich, for example, is uncharacteristically calorie dense. Okay. Like, but on paper to Gen Pop, oh yeah, it's just a sandwich. It's nothing. It's 500 calories, so I don't know. I really struggle in my head to reconcile that part of my brain, which loves the data and the tracking and science, and going, how could, like, intuitive eating, it's all about the calorie at the end of the day. So how can you, I don't know. I can't quite reconcile my head. So I guess, rational based brain likes to know, because otherwise you really don't ever know whether you're in a surplus or deficit, where you're going, and I think a lot of people would tend towards a surplus now in a society where, calories are cheap, calories are very available, and a lot of foods are higher in calories than you'd expect. I think
the other point to make there is that is that intuitive eating assumes that when you are overfilled, that it's a negative experience. But from what you were just saying there, Bill, for some people that's not the case. So that's where your intuitive eating becomes overeating or caloric surplus. I think that for a lot of people, potentially, when you go past that point of being satiated, it is a negative experience. But for a lot of us, it's not, especially in Western society, when we've become used to overconsumption. There is a tendency to overeat if we don't have something to keep us accountable.
Yeah, and something I think I've realized lately, if I wait an hour, if I would just wait an hour before I, have the 7th or 8th piece of pizza, I am full an hour later where I wouldn't want it. But in the moment, I'm still hungry. So there's that part of it. I tend to think, and again, I'm not a psychologist. Don't want to be one. I like being a physiologist. I think a lot of the people promoting intuitive eating, and again, remember what I said, it's the utopia. It's where I wish everybody was. But the people promoting it, I don't think they have large hunger drives. I think they can do that. And they can't understand that some people will they don't want to stop. So I think there are intuitive influencers or researchers, great, flock to them. If that's, I would encourage people, go to them if you can do that. If you need the data, the tracking, then I think my research is probably suited for you. And maybe that's unfortunate. But I like what you were saying. You like the data, you like the track, as do I. But I'm also, I don't want my research to be the standard of my system to be tons of tracking. If it happens to end up there for people who enjoy it, awesome, do that. If people don't like it, I at least want to be able to have something to offer where if you don't want to track things, consider just these. And what are those? Calories, protein, maybe that's it. But I can't lift weights without tracking my reps and sets. Like I would hate lifting if I didn't write that down.
That's it. Like we're all tracking something, right? You know, like whether it's like you said, reps, sets, we're tracking calories, we're tracking steps, we're tracking our age. You know, like how old are you, Will? Like, you know, that's something I'd like to stop tracking. I'll drop that one out. I might incorporate a little bit more calorie tracking and a little bit less age tracking.
I think that's a really useful area though, because I think ultimately if you want to have control of like it's a very nice tool and be able to have control of your body composition and where it's going. Really, the only way you'll ever be able to do that is to have an insight into where your calories are sitting at. I think at the end of the day. So I was curious to see if your utopian ideal, yes, is people can just intuitively eat, maintain body weight, and off we go. That's probably where everyone should strive to. I think before that step comes in, I think there needs to be a lot more probably self-education for people around just the basic nutritional principles. What I think spending time tracking is a really, like, previous guests we've had on here, for example, like Flux Success founder Dean McKillop, for example, he wrote a book recently about life after dieting and the transition away from these cyclical periods of doing caloric deficits, eating at maintenance, and then transitioning from that into a period of maintenance, and then figuring out how to mimic that maintenance with less and less tracking to a point where you are, theoretically sort of, eating intuitively, quote unquote. But you've had by the point you've gotten there, you've done a period of dieting, you know how your body's responding to food. You've also tracked food for that period of time in a flexible environment. So you've got a pretty good understanding of what 100 grams chicken breast looks like, what the macronutrients look like on that. And so I suppose that's a little bit different. It's people like that are interested in your data, Bill. Those sort of people are the people who I think could probably take on some form of intuitive eating. People like us three who are looking as well at, we've sort of been there and done it a little bit with dieting, with tracking, weighing food. I think it'd be really hard though if you hadn't had that exposure to say, just throw them in the deep end almost and just go eat how you feel. And we'll just wait here and see what happens. That'll go well.
That's what most people are already doing, right?
No, we forget that, don't
just we? Eating how they feel, and how's that working out for us?
Yeah,
not ideal. No, but look, Bill, I am thrilled to have you on for part 2 because I know that you've got this next bit of research coming. I'm also interested in. So before we let you go, because I know you've got very valuable time, but I guess for an insight into some research that we're doing now and what's coming up, what can viewers, I suppose, expect to see on your socials or coming up from ongoing research? What's your next area you're looking into that you're going to be studying next?
We're halfway done with this protein tracking study. This is in non-resistant strain females. So the way that I see this study, if you're a coach, like a macro coach or a physique coach, even just a fitness coach, I'm trying to answer the question, do you only need to track protein? And if so, do you even need to track it? Can you just intuitively increase it? So we have 3 groups. One group, we're saying, don't change anything about your diet. Just show up to my lab 3 days per week and lift weights. The other group, we're saying, you must eat 2.2 grams per kg of protein per day. We're going to give you protein after your workouts, protein to take home if you want it to help you hit that, but you need to track it every day. The other group, we're saying, don't track anything. Just tell us what your high protein foods are that you typically eat, and we want you to double 5 of those foods. So if you normally have 2 eggs for breakfast, try to eat 4. If you normally have fish once per week, try to eat fish twice per week. Because that study will tell us, one, if increasing protein is beneficial for a non-resistant trainer, like a beginner client, we know it's more beneficial for trained people, but is it beneficial for Because if it's not, I don't want to tell people to increase protein. That's a hard thing to do. So it would be nice to say, don't worry about it for a couple months. And then secondly, you don't have to track because you can just naturally increase it. Or we're going to find out, not only do you need higher protein, you also need to track it. So that's what we're trying to answer with that study. And then in terms of my social, did you want me just to say where they can find me, or what?
Yeah, certainly. I think also where we can find you, because I mean, if they don't already, which I'm sure most do, but if we can't already find you, where do you like? I take it that your Instagram is probably the place where you disseminate a lot of information regularly. So where can they find you on Instagram, mate, and other platforms that you like to put good data on?
Yeah, I don't like to put good data anywhere else other than Instagram.
Just Instagram.
Save it for the gram.
That's where he published. When he says his study is getting published, he means he's going to put up a post.
It doesn't
a lot easier. I don't have to listen to all the criticisms as reviewers. But yeah, it's at Bill Campbell, PhD, and I talk about all this research on there.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Well, thanks so much for your time today, Bill. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. You've given us so much awesome insight on weight loss and studies you've been doing and refeeds. Really, this has been an absolutely awesome episode for us. And, we've probably pinched a little bit more of your time than what you allowed for. So we're going to let you run. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on, mate.
Yes, thank you guys very much. I love the conversation.
Beautiful. Can't wait to have you on for part 2, mate, after we've done this next study. I'm really intrigued to see where intuitive eating with this protein tracking model ends up. So hopefully we can circle back to this conversation on the next installment. But thanks for listening, everybody. Hopefully you got a lot of value out of today's episode. Hearing Bill, go through some very, very new research. And as always, I hope you pulled some value out of this episode, guys. So thanks for listening. Thanks, Bill. And we'll wrap it up there.